Welcome back to Sip and Talk. We're jumping back in.
Yep, ready to dive deep.
Thanks for joining us again. We're jumping into a topic today that you, our listener, brought up, and it's a really interesting one.
Yeah, it's that assertion you hear sometimes, especially around discussions involving China and Taiwan. You speak Chinese, therefore you are Chinese.
Exactly. And it sounds simple on the surface, doesn't it? But as we'll see, it's anything but simple.
Oh, absolutely not. You scratch that surface just a tiny bit and you find, all these layers, history, culture, politics, identity. It gets complex very, very quickly.
Right. So our mission here, using the info you shared, is to really unpack that statement objectively. We're going to look at the demographics, the actual numbers.
And how language really works in diverse places, not just in theory.
Yeah. And crucially, dig into those deeper currents, the history, the values, the ideology that shape what it means to belong to a nation.
It's about moving beyond just the words people speak to, understand the much bigger picture of identity, trying to see why these things matter so much to people, how they define themselves.
Okay, so let's kick things off right there. The core idea, you speak Chinese, therefore you are Chinese.
It's a potent claim because it tries to draw this straight line, doesn't it? From language skill directly to your fundamental national or ethnic belonging.
Yeah, like it's an automatic equation. You tick the language box, you belong in this national box.
But almost immediately you run into problems with that idea in the real world just because you can speak a language fluently, use it every day.
Right.
That proficiency doesn't automatically make you the same nationally or ethnically as everyone else who speaks it. Languages, sure, it's a huge part of culture for many, but it's not, a passport.
Not a membership card, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, let's use an example we all kind of know. The United States, massive country. What's the main language spoken there?
It's overwhelmingly English, right? For most people, it's the language of daily life, government, media, everything.
Okay, so let's apply that logic we're questioning. If speaking the language defines the nationality, does speaking English make Americans British?
No, obviously not. It sounds kind of ridiculous when you put it that way, doesn't it?
It really does. And the numbers, the demographics we have for the U.S. show exactly why it's ridiculous. We're talking, around 335 million people?
Yeah, huge population. But look at the mix. You've got about, say, 69% white, maybe 12, 13% Black or African American, a really significant Hispanic Latino population, over 19%. And that's an ethnicity, remember, they can be any race.
Plus Asian Americans at nearly 6%, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, people identifying with multiple backgrounds. It's incredibly diverse.
And don't forget, something like over 14% of people living in the U.S. today were born somewhere else. It's a nation fundamentally built on immigration from everywhere.
So American identity clearly isn't tied to some single English ethnic origin. It's based on citizenship, shared ideals, however messy, sometimes a common history in America, and being part of this melting pot. Or maybe salad bowl is better now.
Right, a complex mix anyway. English is the glue, the essential tool for communication that lets this incredibly diverse group function together as one country.
But it doesn't erase where you came from or magically make you English. You're American and something else, often. The language is a bridge, not the destination itself.
Precisely. Okay, so the U.S. example shows how a dominant language doesn't equal the identity of its origin country.
Right. Now let's take another case, geographically closer to the main topic, and with a very different demographic setup, Singapore.
Singapore. It's fascinating because, unlike the U.S., a large majority there are ethnically Chinese. About, 76%?
Yeah, around 3/4. And Chinese, specifically Mandarin, is one of the official languages. So superficially, it looks closer to the assertion, right? Chinese ethnicity, Chinese language?
It does on the surface, but, and this is crucial, Chinese isn't the only official language. They also have English, Malay, and Tamil.
That fact alone tells you something important about how Singapore sees itself, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It reflects the other major ethnic groups. Malays are about 15%, Indians around 7.5%. Singapore's entire national identity project is built around multi-ethnic harmony.
They have that CMIO model, right? Chinese, Malay, Indian, other.
Exactly. And it's not just a label, it actually shapes policy. Things like housing quotas, designed specifically to make sure different groups live together and mix. It's a very deliberate construction of nationhood.
So even with a large Chinese majority speaking Chinese, their primary identity is Singaporean. They might be Singaporean Chinese, but the national identity comes first. tied to Singapore, the nation-state, its specific history, its multicultural focus.
Right. Speaking Chinese is part of the picture for many, a communication tool, but it doesn't override their Singaporean nationality. So both the U.S. and Singapore, in very different ways, show that language alone doesn't define national belonging.
Okay, which brings us back squarely to Taiwan, where this assertion often gets directed, particularly by the PRC. We have some demographic info for Taiwan, too, and it complicates that speak Chinese, be Chinese idea right away.
It does. Taiwan's population is about 23.4 million. And yes, the statistics say around 95-97% are broadly categorized as Han Chinese.
But even Han Chinese in Taiwan isn't monolithic, is it?
Not at all. You have distinct groups with different histories on the island. There are the Minnan or Hoklo people whose ancestors arrived centuries ago. You have the Hakka with their own dialect and traditions. And then the Washington, the mainlanders who came over with the KMT after 1949. They all fall under Han but have different experiences and arrived at different times.
And critically, Taiwan wasn't empty when Han settlers started arriving. There are indigenous peoples.
Yes, a really important point. The indigenous Austronesian peoples, they make up around 2.3% of the population today. That's well over 500,000 people, maybe 570,000 or so based on recent figures. They have completely distinct cultures, languages, histories from the Han majority.
Plus, Taiwan has a growing number of foreign residents, right? Nearly 1 million now.
Yeah, approaching that number, over 4% of the population, mostly from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, adding another layer of diversity.
So when you hear, you speak Chinese, therefore you are Chinese, aimed at Taiwan, meaning belonging to the PRC, the island's actual population mix throws a wrench in that immediately.
Yeah.
You've got indigenous groups, foreign residents.
And even within the Han majority, as we saw with the U.S. and Singapore, speaking the language doesn't automatically equal political affiliation with an external state like the PRC. Taiwan's own internal diversity and history make that simple equation very problematic from the get-go.
Language is a link, sure, but it doesn't define the whole nation or erase the identity developed on Taiwan.
Exactly. It's one thread, but not the whole tapestry.
Okay, so language isn't the be-all and end-all. But you mentioned that even beyond language, while there are shared ethnic roots for many, the comparison between Taiwan and mainland China breaks down pretty quickly when you dig deeper.
It really does, because national identity, what makes a group feel like a distinct nation, is woven from so much more. It's about shared history, yes, but the specific history. It's about culture as it evolves in a place. It's about fundamental values, and crucially, the political system people live under and identify with.
And you flagged something really interesting from the research, that there might even be a biological element to Taiwan's distinctiveness.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. Some genetic studies apparently indicate that, on average, Taiwanese Han Chinese populations show some measurable genetic differences from mainland Han populations.
Oh, so?
The thinking is it's likely due to historical intermingling with Taiwan's indigenous peoples over centuries. So groups like the Pingpu Plains tribes or highland groups, some of their genetic heritage seems to have blended into the Han population on Taiwan.
Wow. So it's not just different waves of Han migration, but also potentially incorporating indigenous ancestry for many. That adds, well, another layer of biological distinction, reinforcing a separate path.
It certainly complicates the idea of a single, undifferentiated Han Chinese identity stretching across the strait. And then you layer on Taiwan's unique historical path as an island. It wasn't always run from the mainland.
Right. It had that Dutch period, then almost 50 years under Japanese rule.
And then the massive change after 1949 with the KMT government relocating, bringing a different group of mainlanders. Each phase left a deep mark.
And shaped the culture, even the language spoken there, right? Like Taiwanese Hokkien.
Exactly. Taiwanese Hokkien, often just called Taiwanese, has evolved differently. It picked up loanwords from Japanese, maybe from indigenous languages too. Its grammar and vocabulary have diverged somewhat from Hokkien spoken just across the strait in Fujian. It reflects Taiwan's specific history, same for Hakka spoken there.
So you've got unique genetics for many, a distinct island history, a culture and language that's related but also uniquely Taiwanese. But the material suggests the biggest gap, the most fundamental difference, lies elsewhere.
Yes. This is where the differences become really profound. Ideology, values, and political systems. This is the bedrock.
Okay, let's compare them directly.
Yeah.
Taiwan's political system.
It's a vibrant, multi-party democracy. Free and fair elections are the norm. People choose their leaders, president, legislators, local officials. Leaders can be voted out. There are checks and balances. Fundamentally, the government's legitimacy comes from the people's consent via voting.
And mainland China.
It's a one-party authoritarian state ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. There are no national popular elections for leadership. The party's legitimacy is built on other things. Its historical narrative, economic performance, nationalism, and importantly, control over information. Power flows from the party elite downwards.
That's a massive difference in how society is structured. And it must impact things like free speech and media.
Oh, absolutely. In Taiwan, you see a generally diverse and free press. There are debates, sure, like in any democracy, about bias or whatever, but the government doesn't systematically censor news. People can and do criticize the government openly, online and off.
Whereas in mainland China,
it's the opposite. Strict censorship is pervasive. The media is state-controlled or heavily guided. Topics the party deems sensitive, historical events like Tiananmen, criticism of leaders, even certain social issues are filtered, blocked. Access to the global internet is restricted by the Great Firewall.
Creating two totally different information worlds for people.
Fundamentally different. One encourages diverse viewpoints and critique. The other actively shapes the narrative and limits exposure to dissent or outside perspectives.
And these structural differences, they naturally lead to different values and worldviews taking root, right?
This is key. In Taiwan, democratic values are deeply ingrained for many. Think about the Sunflower Movement in 2014, students occupying the legislature over a trade deal with China. That showed a generation actively defending their democracy and sovereignty.
A willingness to protest the government itself.
Exactly. There's a strong emphasis on individual liberty, freedom of expression. The culture is generally seen as quite tolerant, open, even having a distinct self-deprecating humor. Taiwan tends to see itself as part of the democratic world, seeking international space.
And contrasting that with mainland China.
The emphasis is often on the collective interest over the individual, on conforming to the system. There's that strong sensitivity to perceived insults, the hi or insulting China phenomenon online, concepts like face, national pride, the Chinese dream of rejuvenation, which explicitly includes reunification with Taiwan, are heavily promoted by the state.
It's a stark contrast. The sources mention Taiwanese youth protesting government versus mainland youth, sometimes disappearing for online speech, yet perhaps believing strongly in the state's narratives about external threats.
It highlights how different the relationship is between the citizen and the state and what's considered acceptable expression. And this is reinforced day in, day out by education and how history is treated. In Taiwan, there's been a move towards transitional justice, acknowledging painful pasts like the White Terror period under martial law. It's messy, but there's an effort to face history, discuss it, even criticize past leaders.
Whereas in mainland China, difficult historical events,
like the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward famine, the Tiananmen crackdown, they are heavily censored, essentially taboo for open public discussion. School textbooks offer the party's official, sanitized version. There's no real space for critical reevaluation of the party's past actions.
So education emphasizes patriotism, party loyalty,
nationalism, the narrative of national victimhood and resurgence. In Taiwan, education puts more emphasis on civic participation, democratic values, critical thinking, understanding Taiwan's own specific story. These create fundamentally different understandings of history, freedom, nationhood.
Okay, so when you put it all together, potential genetic nuances, the island's unique history, the distinct culture and language that evolve, the diametrically opposed political systems, the clashing values, the different ways of remembering the past.
It becomes incredibly clear, doesn't it? Taiwan and mainland China aren't just two places using variations of the same language. They have evolved into profoundly different societies with different identities, different ways of life, different aspirations. The lived reality is vastly different.
Which makes that simple line, speak Chinese, be Chinese, feel incredibly inadequate, even misleading, when it implies they are the same entity or should be.
Exactly. It ignores almost everything that truly defines their separate identities today.
All right, so we've established why the simple language link is flawed and highlighted Taiwan's distinctiveness. Now, let's get to the core issue this raises. Why do so many people in Taiwan react so strongly, so negatively, to being defined as Chinese by the PRC, especially when it implies belonging to the PRC?
Because it's not just about labels for them. It cuts much deeper. It challenges their sense of self, their established local identity that's been forged over generations on that island.
An identity rooted in their specific Taiwanese experience.
Precisely. And the survey data we looked at really drives this home. Remember those numbers. A 2022 poll found about 61% identify only as Taiwanese.
Only Taiwanese. And another chunk, what, 32%?
Yeah, 32% said they identify as both Taiwanese and Chinese, maybe acknowledging cultural links, but still centering a Taiwanese identity. And only a tiny fraction, just over 3%, identified only as Chinese.
Wow. So you're looking at over 92% of the population identifying primarily or solely as Taiwanese. That's not ambiguous. That's a very clear sense of distinct identity.
It's the dominant view, absolutely. It's rooted in family histories on the island, whether recent or centuries old, in their participation in building Taiwan's democracy, in their unique blend of cultures, Hoklo, Hakka, indigenous influences, even traces of Japanese and other periods. It's tied to the place itself.
And for many, the PRC saying you are Chinese isn't just inaccurate, it feels like. Well, a threat, doesn't it? A threat to their whole way of life.
That's exactly how it's often perceived, because being defined as Chinese by Beijing implies being destined for unification, for absorption into the PRC's political system.
Which means losing their democracy, their freedoms.
Exactly. The freedom to vote, to speak, to criticize, to access information freely. These are things they value immensely, things they often contrast sharply with the reality in mainland China. So protecting their democracy is protecting their identity. They are intertwined.
And I guess the constant pressure from Beijing, the military flights, the diplomatic isolation that probably just reinforces the feeling of being separate and threatened rather than feeling like compatriots.
It absolutely does. Those actions are seen as coercion by an external power, not as gestures from kin. It hardens the sense of distinctness and the desire to resist being absorbed.
And the polling reflects that too, right? That huge majority preferring the status quo or independence.
Yes, that 2023 poll showing nearly 89% preferring to maintain the current separate status quo or move towards formal independence versus less than 8% supporting unification. That's a massive public mandate for separateness.
It shows the collective will is clearly not aligned with Beijing's goal.
Not even close. And even culturally, while there are shared roots, daily life isn't the same.
Like the night markets, the music scene.
Yeah, Taiwan's pop culture has its own flavor. The food culture has unique elements. There are indigenous festivals celebrated. And importantly, the continued use and active revitalization efforts for Taiwanese Hokkien, for Hakka, for indigenous languages. These all strengthen local identity, separate from a purely Mandarin-centric view. People often define Taiwanese by this open, democratic, diverse way of life.
Okay, so that's the perspective from Taiwan. Very clear. But we need to understand the other side too. Why do many people in mainland China genuinely seem to believe Taiwan is part of China and that Taiwanese are simply Chinese?
The main engine driving that belief is decades of consistent messaging from the state, through the education system, through state-controlled media.
The official narrative?
Exactly. It relentlessly emphasizes the idea of a single, unified Chinese nation and portrays Taiwan as an inseparable part since ancient times.
They often point to history, like the Qing dynasty.
Yes, Taiwan was under imperial Chinese administration are highlighted. And the shared language, Mandarin, and the Han majority on both sides, are presented as sort of self-evident proof of this inherent unbreakable connection.
And this fits into a broader nationalist narrative.
Very much so. Reunifying Taiwan is framed as essential for achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, correcting historical wrongs like losing Taiwan to Japan in 1895, and overcoming perceived humiliation by foreign powers.
Geopolitics plays a role, too, seeing Taiwan as maybe a U.S. pawn.
That narrative is common in state media, yes. Portraying Taiwan as being manipulated by external forces, which fuels nationalist sentiment for bringing it under Beijing's control to assert China's strength and sphere of influence.
So it's a powerful mix of historical claims, nationalism, and maybe just not fully understanding or acknowledging the reality in Taiwan today.
That's a really crucial part of it mentioned in the material. Given the information control in mainland China, many people there may genuinely not grasp the depth of Taiwan's distinct democratic identity or the strength of public opinion against unification.
They might buy the official line that Taiwanese are somehow brainwashed or have forgotten their roots.
It's possible. They focus on the linguistic and ethnic similarities, which are real, but miss the profound political, social, and psychological divergence that has occurred over the past 70-plus years, and indeed over centuries before that.
Okay, this leads perfectly into that thought experiment you mentioned. This really helps crystallize the feeling from the Taiwanese perspective.
It's quite effective, I think, for empathy. Puts you in their shoes.
All right, let's try it.
Listeners have probably heard this before, but let's do it again.
Yeah. Imagine North Korea suddenly started claiming that people in mainland China are actually part of the Korean nation.
Right. And their justification might be, pointing to some shared history thousands of years ago, maybe some linguistic overlap in ancient times, maybe shared pottery styles from the Neolithic period. They might say, we're historically linked. You're part of Greater Korea. Time to unify under Pyongyang.
Okay, so if you're living in Beijing or Shanghai today, and you hear Kim Jong-un saying this, how do you react?
The likely reaction, as the experiment suggests, would be disbelief, maybe anger, definitely offense. You'd probably think, what are you talking about? We're Chinese. We have 5,000 years of our own civilization. Confucius, the Great Wall. We have our own language, culture, history.
You feel like your entire identity, your reality, is being dismissed, erased, annexed by this external claim based on some cherry-picked ancient history.
Exactly. You'd feel profoundly misrepresented. And you might even think, and you're claiming me, a place with, let's just say, a very different standard of living and level of freedom.
Yeah, that adds another layer of incredulity. Okay, so the point is, this feeling of outrage and offense mirrors how many Taiwanese feel when the PRC asserts they are simply Chinese and belong to the PRC. It's not about denying any shared cultural or historical threads exist. Like, the person in China isn't denying some ancient interaction with Korea happened.
Right. It's like the soy milk and milk analogy given. Both might be white liquid. Maybe they share some abstract quality, but they are fundamentally different products. You can't just declare soy milk is milk and belongs in the dairy section.
So the core objection from Taiwan isn't necessarily a total rejection of shared heritage for many, but it's a fundamental rejection of the right of an external political power to define their nationality and dictate their political future.
Precisely. It's about demanding respect for their distinct identity as it exists now and their right to self-determination. It's saying you don't get to define us based on your political goals and your reading of history, just like the person in China would reject being defined as Korean.
That really clarifies the emotional core of it. And as you said earlier, this dynamic language, culture, ethnicity, politics, identity. It's not just a Taiwan-China issue, is it? We see variations of this globally.
Absolutely. It encourages us to think bigger. Does shared language or culture automatically mean political unity is required or justified? The evidence suggests no.
Yeah, think about the Anglosphere again. The UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Shared language, deep historical and cultural roots.
Similar legal traditions in many ways. But nobody seriously argues they should all merge into one superstate because they speak English. They are distinct sovereign nations. Cultural affinity doesn't equal political obligation.
The sources use the example of, say, a Korean temple being built overseas. Its presence doesn't make that land politically Korean.
Right. But somehow, when it comes to Taiwan, shared language or cultural elements are often presented by Beijing as direct justification for a political claim over the people and territory. It's applying a different standard.
Which links to that fundamental idea. The right to self-define. Who gets to decide who a group is?
It's a universal question. Look at other Chinese-speaking communities in Asia. People in Hong Kong fighting to maintain their distinct identity. Singaporeans, Malaysians of Chinese descent, they speak Chinese, engage with Chinese culture, but are unequivocally Singaporean or Malaysian first. Their national identity is rooted locally.
So Taiwan's struggle for international recognition, to be called by its own name, is part of this broader fight for the right to exist as defined by its own people, not by an external claimant.
Exactly. How legitimate is an identity that's imposed from outside versus one that arises from the collective self-understanding of the people living there? You see echoes and struggles of indigenous peoples worldwide, minority groups resisting assimilation, regions seeking autonomy like Scotland, or contested situations like Tibet or the Kurds. It's about who defines belonging.
And it highlights how language and culture, while positive things, can be weaponized politically.
They can be. The material differentiated between genuine cultural sharing and more politically motivated efforts, sometimes called united front work or soft power, that aim to influence or co-opt.
Things like leveraging overseas Chinese associations, the role of Confucius institutes in the past, exerting pressure on businesses or artists to toe a certain political line.
Right. The point being, engaging with Chinese culture, speaking the language, enjoying the food, celebrating festivals, doesn't automatically make someone politically aligned with the PRC or negate their own distinct national identity, whether that's Taiwanese, Singaporean, American, or anything else. Cultural appreciation isn't political submission.
And finally, this all makes us think about nationalism itself.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? It can build unity and shared purpose within a group, but it can also become exclusionary, defining itself by who is not part of the group, or justifying control over others based on simplistic criteria like language or a selective history.
The contrast was drawn between China's old 5 races under one union ideal versus the current realities for groups like Uyghurs in Xinjiang or Tibetans, or the situation in Hong Kong, where unity feels imposed rather than organic.
And you can compare that approach to how other diverse countries manage multiple languages and ethnicities. Think of Switzerland with its German, French, Italian regions, or Belgium with French and Dutch speakers, or India with its dozens of official languages.
They often build national identity around shared citizenship, democratic structures, maybe federalism, rather than trying to force everyone into one linguistic or ethnic mold.
It shows there are different ways to build a nation, some perhaps more inclusive in a complex world. National identity involves history, culture, language, values. But maybe, just maybe, the most crucial element today is that collective will, the self-recognition of the people living there.
Wow. Okay, that was a really comprehensive journey through a seemingly simple phrase. Let's try and quickly pull the main threads together.
Okay. First, the big takeaway. Speaking a certain language just doesn't automatically equate to national or political identity. We saw that with the U.S., with Singapore. Language is important, but it's not destiny.
Second, Taiwan's identity is multi-layered and distinct. It's shaped by its diverse population, its unique island history, its own cultural evolution, and critically, by its democratic system and values, which are fundamentally different from mainland China's.
And third, that's why the assertion, you speak Chinese, therefore you are Chinese, when used by the PRC to claim Taiwan, is so strongly rejected by most Taiwanese. It ignores all that complexity, dismisses their lived reality, and denies their right to define themselves and their future.
Right. It's not necessarily about cutting off all cultural ties for everyone, but about rejecting an external political definition. Like, that thought experiment showed nobody wants their identity dictated by someone else based on language or ancient history alone.
Exactly. The core issue is the political claim smuggled inside the linguistic one. It's fundamentally about respecting autonomy and self-determination.
So maybe the final thought for you, our listener, to mull over after all this is, in a world like ours, with so much movement and connection, who really gets the final say on defining a group's identity? Is it history, culture, language, ethnicity, political values? Or is it, perhaps most importantly, the collective will and the self-recognition of the people themselves?
It's something to think about in many contexts, not just this one. How identity works in your own community, how it's perceived.
Definitely. And thank you so much for sending in the material that sparked this whole deep dive. We really couldn't have explored it in this way without your input.
It was genuinely fascinating to unpack all these different facets.
And hey, if you found this deep dive interesting, make sure you subscribe to the deep dive. That way you won't miss any of our future explorations.
And you know, speaking of interesting things, you should definitely check out our old friend Micky's YouTube channel.
Oh yeah. Micky's channel is great. Seriously, he's got everything: funny memes, cool music mixes, travel stuff. I think he even does wine tasting sometimes. It's just good fun. Go check it out.
You don't regret it. Good stuff over there.
Thanks so much for listening.
Tune in next time for another episode of Sip and Talk.